It is the morning of June 4th, 1942. The flight deck of the Japanese aircraft carrier Akagi radiates supreme confidence. The first strike on Midway is complete, and the architects of Pearl Harbor appear to be the undisputed masters of the Pacific. To the pilots and crews awaiting orders, nothing hints at catastrophe. Yet this magnificent warship is already dead. Its fate was sealed not by the American dive bombers, currently nowhere in sight, but by a short, mundane radio message sent weeks earlier. A message Japanese intelligence intercepted, read, and completely voluntarily answered, handing the Americans exactly what they needed. How do you force a sophisticated enemy to expose their own top-secret target without fully breaking their code and without asking a single direct question? Usually, the story of Midway is told through the deafening roar of dive bombers and the desperate courage of torpedo squadrons. We are conditioned to focus on those chaotic 5 minutes that supposedly changed the course of the war. But that is only the climax, not the cause. This is the story of how the most devastating carrier strike force on Earth was systematically condemned long before it ever sailed into battle. It was doomed by a tiny informational footprint and one flawlessly executed lie. This is the anatomy of an intelligence trap so simple and elegant, it completely bypassed the need to fully unravel complex enemy cryptography. The mechanics of the deception followed a brilliant, fatal formula. The enemy hides their ultimate target behind a cipher. The Americans develop a strong suspicion, but they lack the absolute proof required to risk throwing their few surviving ships into the line of fire. Staring at an incomplete puzzle, they decide to manufacture a piece of incredibly mundane bait. The enemy takes it, processes it, and then unknowingly transmits the final confirmation of their own top-secret objective. They effectively hand their adversaries the blueprints for a perfectly timed ambush. How did an otherwise boring, routine administrative complaint transform into the most lethal weapon in the entire Pacific? To understand how such a remarkably simple trick could work, you have to immerse yourself in the sheer desperation of the spring of 1942. The Pacific Ocean did not belong to the United States. It was effectively a Japanese lake. In the agonizing months immediately following the surprise attack on Pearl Harbor, the Imperial Japanese Navy had unleashed an unbroken wave of conquests that seemed to defy military logistics. The Philippines had fallen, trapping thousands of American troops. Wake Island had been overrun. Guam was gone. The rich resources of Java and the Dutch East Indies had been swiftly seized. Wherever the Japanese carrier strike force appeared, fire and destruction inevitably followed. Their naval aviation, manned by combat-hardened veterans, was, by every observable metric, invincible. The United States Pacific Fleet, bleeding and fractured, was operating on a terrifying razor's edge. The mighty battleships were resting in the oily mud of Pearl Harbor. All that stood between the vulnerable American West Coast and total Japanese dominion were a few precious aircraft carriers. There was zero margin for error. If the United States Navy guessed wrong about where the Japanese would strike next, if they positioned those few surviving carriers in the wrong stretch of ocean, the ships would be outflanked, isolated, and destroyed. If those flight decks were lost, the Pacific War would effectively be over before America's industrial capacity had fully mobilized. The pressure on the American High Command was absolute. They desperately needed to know what the Japanese were planning, but the vast expanse of the Pacific offered no physical clues. The front line of this desperate intelligence war was not located on the armored bridge of a battleship. It was located 15 feet underground, beneath a mundane administration building at the Pearl Harbor Navy Yard. Down in a windowless, heavily fortified basement, universally nicknamed the Dungeon, the air was constantly thick with stale cigarette smoke and the relentless clattering of early IBM punch-card tabulating machines. This was Station HYPO. It was the absolute nerve center of the United States Navy's combat intelligence, manned by a strange, insular mix of cryptanalysts, linguists, and mathematicians who rarely saw the sun. At the center of this subterranean world was Commander Joseph Rochefort, eccentric, Fiercely intelligent and utterly exhausted, Rochefort often padded around the concrete floor in a smoking jacket and carpet slippers to ward off the chill, fueled by endless cups of bitter coffee and an unyielding obsession with the Japanese mind. Rochefort and his dedicated team were locked in a grueling, high-stakes intellectual wrestling match with the Japanese Navy's primary operational code, a fiendishly complex system designated as JN-25. Popular culture often treats military code-breaking like flipping a magical switch. One day, the intercepted text is scrambled gibberish, and the next day, it reads like a clear, typewritten letter detailing the enemy's exact plans. The grim reality inside Station HYPO was nothing like that. JN-25 was an incredibly sophisticated, super-enciphered code. The Japanese would use a massive codebook to turn a word into a 5-digit number, then add another number from a constantly changing book of random additives to completely obscure the original cipher. The cryptanalysts in HYPO were not reading neatly translated Japanese operational orders. They were staring at endless oceans of 5-digit groups, painfully stripping away the mathematical layers just to recover isolated fragments of sentences. At their absolute best, they were reading maybe 10 or 15% of the actual words being transmitted. They were agonizing over a massive jigsaw puzzle, missing 80% of its pieces, with no picture on the box to guide them. Because they could not read the exact contents of most messages, Rochefort and his team relied heavily on the delicate art of traffic analysis. They didn't just need to know what was being said, they needed to know who was saying it, to whom they were speaking, and how often. They painstakingly tracked the unique radio call signs of individual Japanese warships and land bases. They watched the overall volume of radio traffic swell and recede. If a powerful carrier division suddenly went completely silent, while a logistics base began furiously exchanging messages with a destroyer squadron, the analysts could deduce that a major movement was underway without reading a single word of text. They were effectively reading the shadows the Japanese fleet cast against the invisible wall of the radio spectrum. By the late spring of 1942, those shadows were growing monstrous. The traffic analysis within Station HYPO began to spike ominously. Support units were moving. Massive amounts of supplies were being requisitioned. Carrier call signs were appearing in the radio traffic in ways that suggested a massive reorganization. Rochefort could clearly see the sprawling machinery of the Imperial Japanese Navy winding up for an operation of unprecedented scale. An armada was gathering. The cryptanalysts could piece together enough fragments to understand that a potentially decisive strike was imminent. But the most critical piece of the entire strategic puzzle, the actual physical target of this colossal fleet, remained deeply hidden. In the partially decoded messages, the Japanese continuously referred to their upcoming objective using a 2-letter geographic designator, AF. As the days ticked by, those 2 letters began appearing everywhere. Aviation fuel was being allocated for operations near AF. Detailed weather reports were being urgently requested for the specific area around AF. Attack forces were being meticulously briefed on their approach routes to AF. It was undeniably the focal point of the largest naval offensive the Japanese had mounted since Pearl Harbor. But nobody in the United States military could definitively say what or where AF actually was. The asymmetry of information was terrifying. The United States was hanging by a thread, staring down the barrel of a catastrophic impending attack, forced to deduce the survival of their entire nation's Pacific strategy from fragmented, partially read radio traffic and 2 obscure letters. To place the few remaining American aircraft carriers in ambush at the wrong island meant handing the Pacific over to the Japanese without a fight. The fate of the entire war rested not on the guns of a battleship, but on the agonizing necessity of solving those 2 hidden letters. Down in the suffocating air of Station HYPO, Joseph Rochefort was not paralyzed by the mystery. By cross-referencing past Japanese flight patterns and older, fragmented intercepts, specifically a forgotten message detailing a Japanese reconnaissance seaplane requiring refueling near AF, Rochefort became absolutely convinced of the target's identity. AF was Midway Atoll. It was a tiny, 2-square-mile speck of coral and sand that served as the ultimate sentry guarding the western approach to Hawaii. But deducing this in a Hawaiian basement was one thing. Convincing the highest levels of the United States military was an entirely different battle. Over in Washington, D.C., the Navy's intelligence chiefs fundamentally disagreed. They looked at the exact same decrypted fragments and saw a completely different war. Washington insisted that AF designated a target much closer to the American mainland. They argued the Japanese were aiming for the Aleutian Islands in Alaska, or perhaps preparing to strike the West Coast itself. It is incredibly easy, in retrospect, to dismiss the analysts in Washington as bureaucratic or foolish, but they were neither. The Japanese were, in fact, preparing a massive secondary offensive aimed at the Aleutian chain. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto had deliberately designed his sprawling operation to be overwhelmingly complex, generating overlapping waves of radio traffic. Genuinely contradictory signals were flooding the airwaves, allowing highly intelligent men in both Pearl Harbor and Washington to construct perfectly plausible yet entirely opposite models of the impending Japanese attack. Caught dead in the center of this bitter intelligence dispute was Admiral Chester W. Nimitz, the commander-in-chief of the Pacific Fleet. Nimitz faced an agonizing strategic dilemma. Rochefort had recently been proven correct about a Japanese thrust into the Coral Sea, but that intelligence had been incomplete, and the resulting battle had been brutally costly. The carrier Lexington was now sitting at the bottom of the ocean, and the Yorktown was severely damaged. Being merely right on a macro level was no longer acceptable. If Nimitz trusted Rochefort now and committed his final surviving flight decks to an ambush at Midway, but Washington turned out to be correct, the American carriers would be thousands of miles out of position. The Japanese armada would descend upon Alaska or Hawaii unopposed. A mistake here did not just mean losing a single battle. It meant losing the entire Pacific Fleet, leaving the American coastline entirely defenseless. The terrifying reality for Rochefort was that an intelligence hunch, no matter how deeply rooted in mathematical patterns, was simply not enough to justify risking the survival of the United States Navy. He could not win the argument with Washington by simply pointing to radio traffic volume or partial decrypts. The debate would endlessly drag on until Japanese bombs actually began to fall. Rochefort realized that generating more analysis was useless. He needed undeniable, irrefutable proof. He needed a smoking gun that would instantly silence the skeptics in Washington and give Admiral Nimitz the political and military cover to bet the entire war on one specific spot in the ocean. But the cryptanalysts at HYPO were at a dead end. They did not have the time or the complete codebooks to rapidly strip away the remaining layers of JN25. The encryption hiding the true meaning of AF was holding firm. Therefore, Rochefort concluded, they had to bypass the cryptography entirely. If the Americans could not break the code to read what AF meant, they had to engineer a scenario where the Imperial Japanese Navy would voluntarily translate it for them. They needed to manufacture a highly specific piece of information, a unique, recognizable fact, and somehow trick the Japanese into broadcasting that exact fact in the same sentence as the letters AF. To manufacture this highly specific piece of information, Joseph Rochefort and his team needed to design a lie that was absolutely invisible. If Pearl Harbor ordered Midway to broadcast a fake, panicked radio message claiming they had suddenly run out of anti-aircraft ammunition or aviation fuel, the Japanese intelligence network might easily spot the deception. The Imperial Japanese Navy possessed extensive spy networks and pre-war logistical data. They could simply calculate the tonnage of American supply ships that had recently docked at the atoll and conclude that an ammunition shortage was mathematically impossible. Furthermore, an overt military crisis sounded exactly like the kind of bait a desperate enemy would use to mask an ambush. The trap had to be entirely devoid of military significance. It had to be a problem so profoundly boring, so structurally mundane, that the Japanese would never suspect it was a carefully engineered weapon of psychological warfare. The analysts in the basement found their perfect weapon in the geographic reality of Midway itself. The atoll is a tiny, isolated formation of coral and sand baking under the relentless Pacific sun. It possesses absolutely no natural sources of fresh water. There are no rivers, no springs, no subterranean aquifers. For the thousands of American Marines, sailors, and aviators stationed on the island, survival was entirely dependent on a mechanical lifeline: heavy industrial desalination equipment. A water condenser is a complex piece of machinery involving high-pressure steam, delicate copper tubing, and continuous maintenance. A catastrophic mechanical failure of a desalination plant is not only plausible on a remote island, it is an inevitable administrative headache. A blown gasket, a ruptured intake valve, or a cracked boiler would instantly trigger a countdown to a fatal dehydration crisis for the entire garrison. It was a purely logistical vulnerability, precisely the kind of tedious operational detail that a vigilant intelligence officer loves to intercept because it represents an unforced error by the enemy. The execution of the deception required strict, compartmentalized secrecy. The United States military could not simply transmit the executed deception of this magnitude. Joseph Rochefort understood that the bait had to be profoundly, aggressively mundane. It could not be a dramatic, theatrical fabrication. If the Americans suddenly broadcasted a fake invasion plan or panicked messages about a phantom carrier task force, the highly sophisticated Japanese intelligence network would immediately recognize the anomaly. The Imperial Japanese Navy was too disciplined to swallow massive, uncorroborated lies. The bait had to be an administrative problem so exceptionally boring, so deeply grounded in the miserable, unglamorous daily realities of remote island garrison life, that it would completely bypass the enemy's suspicion. The perfect solution, Rochefort realized, was a broken piece of machinery, specifically a water distillation condenser. Midway Atoll is exactly what its name implies: a fragile, isolated ring of coral reef surrounding a pair of tiny islands in the middle of a vast, unforgiving saltwater desert. It possesses absolutely zero natural freshwater springs. Every single drop of drinking water required to sustain the thousands of United States Marines, naval aviators, and support crew stationed on the sand had to be mechanically produced by heavy industrial desalination plants or shipped in across thousands of miles of ocean at massive logistical cost. If the evaporators failed, the garrison would literally begin dying of thirst within a matter of weeks. It was a critical, existential vulnerability for the base, but more importantly, for the Codebreakers, it was a completely believable one. Heavy machinery constantly breaks down in the corrosive, hyper-salty air of the Pacific environment. Complaining about broken equipment was the universal language of every military outpost on Earth. Using a highly secure, heavily insulated underwater telegraph cable that physically connected the island to Hawaii, a hardline communication channel that the Japanese Navy could not possibly intercept from the airwaves, Pearl Harbor secretly contacted the American base commander on Midway. They issued a bizarre, highly specific operational order. Midway was instructed to transmit a radio message back to Pearl Harbor, deliberately using plain, unencrypted English, urgently reporting that their primary water distillation plant had suffered a catastrophic mechanical breakdown. They were ordered to state clearly and frantically that they only had enough fresh water remaining in their storage tanks to last for roughly 2 weeks. The sheer, terrifying elegance of this intelligence trap lay entirely in its total lack of drama. The Americans were not attempting to convince Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto that the United States Pacific Fleet was strong and waiting for him. They were deliberately projecting a highly specific bureaucratic weakness. They were throwing a piece of boring administrative trash out into the open radio spectrum, betting their entire strategic future that the meticulous Japanese intelligence-gathering apparatus would pick it up. analyze it, and dutifully catalog it as a genuine logistical crisis. Once the plain text message was broadcast from the radio towers on Midway, a suffocating, almost unbearable tension settled over the subterranean basement of Station HYPO. The trap had been set, the bait was in the water, but the cryptanalysts were now completely powerless to spring it. They could only sit in their windowless, heavily fortified bunker and listen to the static of the world. The Pacific Ocean is unimaginably massive, and the ether was crowded with the chaotic, overlapping electronic chatter of a global world war. There was absolutely no guarantee that a Japanese listening post had even tuned their receivers to that specific American frequency at that exact moment. And even if they had intercepted the plain text message through the atmospheric interference, there was no guarantee whatsoever that the Japanese command would consider a broken water pipe important enough to report up their own chain of command. If the enemy simply ignored the administrative complaint, or if a low-level Japanese officer just logged it locally in a notebook without transmitting it back to Tokyo for strategic analysis, the resulting silence would effectively condemn the American fleet. The bitter debate with Washington over the true identity of Target AF would remain entirely unresolved, and Admiral Nimitz would be forced to guess where to place his surviving aircraft carriers, risking the total annihilation of the United States Navy. Hours bled into days inside the dungeon. The heavy steel doors remained sealed. The air conditioning struggled against the heat of the Hawaiian territory and the constant, thick haze of cigarette smoke. The early IBM punch card tabulating machines clattered relentlessly, mechanically sorting through mountains of 5-digit intercept groups pouring in from Allied listening posts positioned across the Pacific, from the beaches of Oahu to the distant intelligence stations in Melbourne and Belconnen, Australia. Rochefort and his dedicated team of linguists and mathematicians stared at the endless paper printouts, their eyes bloodshot, fueled by nothing but adrenaline, anxiety, and stale coffee. Every single time a new batch of JN-25 intercepts arrived via pneumatic tube, the analysts frantically scanned the endless columns of numbers, desperately searching for the specific mathematical blocks they had already identified as representing the two-letter geographic designator AF. They were waiting for an echo. They needed the Japanese military to take the American lie, translate it into their own top-secret cipher, and broadcast it back out into the world. If the Japanese intelligence system functioned with the ruthless, methodical efficiency the Americans believed it did, some unknown enemy officer sitting in a tropical listening post was, at this very moment, inadvertently drafting the death warrant for his own magnificent fleet. Thousands of miles away, on the Japanese-held atoll of Kwajalein in the Marshall Islands, the enemy's radio operators had indeed been listening. They intercepted the uncoded American transmission about the broken water condenser. To the Japanese intelligence officers meticulously analyzing the intercept, this was not a trick. It was an incredibly valuable piece of logistical intelligence. It strongly indicated that a key American defensive outpost was suddenly suffering a severe supply crisis just as the Imperial fleet was preparing to descend upon it. It perfectly validated their assumption that the Americans were disorganized, undersupplied, and vulnerable. Following standard, rigid military protocol, the Japanese listening station immediately drafted an intelligence report to inform Naval Command in Tokyo of this fortuitous development. The Japanese radio men took the information they had just learned, encrypted it using their massive codebooks, layered it with the JN-25 super cipher additives to render it completely unreadable to anyone without the key, and transmitted it across the Pacific. They believed they were securely communicating a vital weakness of the enemy. Instead, inside Station HYPO in Pearl Harbor, an American radio man caught the signal. The intercepted Japanese transmission was rapidly rushed down the concrete stairs into the basement. The cryptanalysts tore into the 5-digit groups with a ferocious intensity. Because they already knew the underlying mathematical additives the Japanese were using for this specific communication timeframe, they didn't need to break the entire message. They didn't need to read every single word. They only needed to mathematically strip away enough layers of the supercipher to read a few highly specific nouns. The numbers aligned. The cipher cracked open just enough. The translated Japanese intercept read, AF is short of fresh water. In that single electrifying moment in the smoke-filled basement, the entire strategic landscape of the Pacific War violently inverted. The Imperial Japanese Navy had not just fallen for a deception, they had actively, mechanically participated in it. By attempting to share a piece of stolen tactical intelligence with their own high command, they had unwittingly handed the Americans the Rosetta Stone for the entire Midway operation. The enemy had voluntarily decoded their own supreme secret. There was no more ambiguity. There was no more room for Washington analysts to theoretically argue about the Aleutian Islands, or a strike on the West Coast, or a feint toward Australia. The puzzle was solved. AF was Midway. The Japanese were coming to Midway. Lieutenant Commander Edwin Layton, the Pacific Fleet's brilliant and deeply trusted intelligence officer, took the freshly decrypted intercept out of the basement, walked it up into the sunlight, and carried it directly into the office of Admiral Chester W. Nimitz. Layton laid the typed paper on the Admiral's desk. The proof was absolute, mathematically verifiable, and unassailable. Yet, possessing the enemy's deepest secret and actually acting upon it are two entirely different realms of command responsibility. Even with the water message intercept sitting in plain sight, there was still intense, high-level friction. Admiral Ernest King, the fiercely stubborn commander-in-chief of the United States Fleet, sitting in Washington, D.C., remained deeply skeptical of the Hawaiian codebreakers. The bureaucratic inertia of the capital still leaned heavily toward the belief that the Japanese were preparing a multi-pronged attack that directly threatened the American mainland. Washington possessed massive intelligence resources of its own, and the senior admirals there were incredibly hesitant to yield total operational control to the conclusions of a rogue, sleep-deprived cryptanalyst wearing carpet slippers in a Pearl Harbor basement. Nimitz was staring at a terrifying, apocalyptic command calculus. If he fully committed his forces to an ambush at Midway, and HYPO was somehow wrong, if the Japanese had somehow orchestrated a massive, double-blind deception of their own and faked the water message response, he would be willfully moving the last remaining shield of the American Republic completely out of position. If Nimitz sent the carriers to Midway and the Japanese struck the West Coast, the United States Navy would be outflanked and annihilated, and he would go down in history as the admiral who lost the war. But Nimitz possessed a rare, cold-blooded operational clarity. He looked at the methodology of the trap. He looked at the irrefutable, elegant logic of the water message. He chose to trust the exhausted men in the basement over the pristine admirals in Washington. Nimitz decisively ended the debate. He issued the operational orders to concentrate every available American flight deck at a specific, seemingly empty patch of ocean northeast of Midway Atoll, a coordinate designated simply as Point Luck. He was betting the absolute survival of the United States Navy and arguably the outcome of the war in the Pacific on a single, intercepted sentence about a broken desalination plant. But brilliant intelligence is utterly useless if you do not possess the physical, mechanical capacity to exploit it. Knowing the exact time and place of an ambush means absolutely nothing if you have no weapons to bring to the fight. Information alone cannot sink a battleship. To properly execute Nimitz's trap, the Americans desperately needed aircraft carriers. At that exact moment, they only had two fully operational in the entire Pacific theater, the USS Enterprise and the USS Hornet. Against Admiral Nagumo's massive, veteran striking force of 4 fleet carriers, 2 American carriers were simply not enough. The mathematics of naval aviation dictated that they desperately needed a 3rd flight deck to have any realistic chance of surviving the engagement, let alone winning it. The USS Yorktown had just limped back into the channel at Pearl Harbor after barely surviving the brutal, chaotic Battle of the Coral Sea. The magnificent ship was a floating, catastrophic wreck. An 800-pound Japanese armor-piercing bomb had detonated deep inside her hull, violently destroying reinforced bulkheads, rupturing critical aviation fuel lines, and leaving her trailing a massive, shimmering oil slick across the Pacific. The initial engineering assessment from the Navy's damage control experts was incredibly grim. The Yorktown required at least 90 days of extensive repairs in a fully equipped dry dock on the west coast mainland just to become marginally combat-ready again. Nimitz didn't have 90 days. He had roughly 72 hours before the fleet had to sail to meet the Japanese advance. As the crippled carrier carefully slid into dry dock number 1 at the Pearl Harbor Navy Yard, the massive pumps drained the seawater away, revealing a gaping, jagged crater in her steel hull. Admiral Nimitz personally descended into the flooded dry dock, wearing high rubber boots, to inspect the devastating damage with his own eyes. He turned to his exhausted repair officers, looked at the twisted metal, and issued an impossible, uncompromising directive. "We must have this ship back in 3 days." What followed was a masterpiece of desperate industrial logistics, an epic of sheer human endurance that was every bit as crucial to the victory at Midway as the brilliant code-breaking in Station HYPO. The moment the dry dock cleared of water, an army of over 1,400 civilian shipfitters, welders, electricians, and mechanics swarmed the shattered hull of the Yorktown. They did not wait for the massive ship to cool down. They waded directly into dark, twisted compartments that were still suffocatingly hot and reeking of toxic fumes, aviation gas, and scorched wiring. Rolling blackouts systematically swept across the civilian neighborhoods of Honolulu as the Navy Yard ruthlessly siphoned off massive amounts of the island's electrical grid to simultaneously power hundreds of welding arcs. There was absolutely no time for standard naval architecture, proper engineering blueprints, or bureaucratic safety protocols. When heavy steel bulkheads were too warped and damaged to properly repair, the shipyard workers simply torched them away and welded massive steel I-beams directly across the gaps to violently force the hull back into alignment. Thick wooden beams were aggressively shoved into place to temporarily shore up weakened internal structures. The great ship was literally patched together with raw civilian labor, adrenaline, and brute mechanical force. This is the often ignored, grueling reality of warfare. Intelligence provided the invisible map, but it was the shipyard laborers, working blindly through the night amid blinding showers of sparks and the deafening, bone-rattling roar of pneumatic hammers, who physically built the ambush. In exactly 3 days, defying every known law of naval engineering, the Yorktown backed out of the dry dock. She was still bearing the black, scorched scars of battle, and she was still carrying civilian repair crews who were frantically welding inside her dark corridors as she sailed toward the open ocean. She steamed out to join the Enterprise and the Hornet. The mechanical trap was finally armed. While the Americans were violently tearing their ships apart and putting them back together to meet the deadline, the Imperial Japanese Navy was sailing eastward with a supreme, almost blinding sense of invincibility. Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo stood calmly on the flag bridge of the carrier Akagi, commanding a terrifying, unprecedented concentration of naval power. Steaming in tight formation around him were the Kaga, the Soryu, and the Hiryu, the exact same elite, battle-hardened fleet carriers that had devastated Pearl Harbor 6 months earlier. The sky above them was heavily protected by the legendary Mitsubishi Zero fighters, flown by the most experienced, ruthless, and highly trained naval aviators on the planet. Admiral Yamamoto's overarching operational plan for Midway was a staggering monument to strategic complexity. It involved multiple, highly dispersed task forces, elaborate decoy invasions far to the north in the Aleutians, advanced submarine cordons, and a massive, heavily armored battleship fleet trailing hundreds of miles behind the carriers. The entire plan was meticulously designed to draw the terrified remnants of the American fleet out of their safe harbors in Hawaii and crush them in a decisive, final annihilation battle. But extreme complexity is the natural enemy of execution in warfare. The Japanese plan relied entirely on rigid timetables, perfect execution, and flawless information. Yet they were already operating completely in the dark, and they did not even know it. Yamamoto had designed a critical, highly specific reconnaissance mission to ensure the trap was ready, designated as Operation K. The Japanese intended to fly massive, 4-engine Kawanishi flying boats, some of the longest-range aircraft in the world, directly over Pearl Harbor to visually confirm whether the American aircraft carriers were still safely anchored there, because even the massive flying boats lacked the range to make a non-stop round trip from the Japanese bases in the Marshall Islands to Hawaii. They were scheduled to land in the open ocean at French Frigate Shoals, a remote, uninhabited atoll halfway to Pearl Harbor, where they would be secretly refueled by waiting Japanese submarines. It was a brilliant, highly sophisticated logistical maneuver. But when the Japanese submarines arrived at the dark waters of the shoals to set up the refueling point, they were shocked to find American seaplane tenders already heavily anchored in the exact coordinates they needed. The Americans, acting on earlier intelligence fragments provided by HYPO, had quietly moved ships to block the rendezvous point. Unable to surface and refuel the flying boats, the Japanese submarines aborted the mission. Operation K was immediately canceled. No Japanese aircraft flew over Pearl Harbor. This should have been a massive, glaring red flag to the Japanese High Command. It meant their primary method of confirming the enemy's location had completely failed. Yet, deeply infected by the disease of victory, they shrugged off the failure. They simply assumed, without any visual evidence, that the American carriers were still sitting helplessly in Pearl Harbor, paralyzed by fear, heavy damage, and command indecision. They fundamentally believed they held the ultimate element of surprise. They believed they were stalking a terrified enemy that had absolutely no idea the full wrath of the Imperial Navy was bearing down upon them. Admiral Nagumo's elite carrier strike force continued to slice eastward through the heavy, rolling Pacific swells, maintaining absolute, disciplined radio silence. The Japanese officers on the bridge of the Akagi were entirely convinced they were setting a brilliant, inescapable trap for the United States Navy. They were catastrophically wrong. The asymmetry of information had completely reversed, turning the entire theater of war upside down. The hunters were blindly, confidently sailing directly into the jaws of an ambush they had unknowingly helped design. Because of a fake, completely fabricated complaint about a broken water pipe, 3 American aircraft carriers were already waiting silently in the fog at Point Luck, perfectly positioned on the vulnerable flank of the Japanese advance. The intelligence phase of the battle had worked with terrifying mathematical perfection. The Americans had successfully manipulated the enemy into voluntarily revealing their exact target, and the massive, brute force industrial machinery of the United States had physically delivered the heavily damaged fleet to the right coordinates just in time. But war is not a mathematical equation solved on a chalkboard in a basement. Placing your ships in the exact right position on a map is only the prerequisite for survival. Knowing the exact location of an ambush does absolutely nothing to guarantee that you will actually survive the ferocious, chaotic, terrifying reality of the execution. The codebreakers and the shipyard workers had done everything humanly possible to level the playing field. Now, the heavy burden of the Pacific War shifted away from the silent, subterranean basement in Hawaii and moved out into the vast, open sky, where hundreds of young men in fragile, highly combustible machines were about to hurl themselves into a maelstrom of anti-aircraft fire and swarming enemy fighters. On the morning of June 4th, the intelligence triumph delivered on its promise. Emerging from the horizon, the 4 massive flight decks of the 1st Air Fleet appeared precisely where the codebreakers in the basement had predicted. The trap was sprung. But the moment the physical battle began, the brilliant strategic ambush transformed into a catastrophic tactical slaughter. Wave after wave of American torpedo squadrons descended upon the Japanese fleet, flying obsolete, painfully slow Douglas TBD Devastators, skimming just feet above the ocean. The aviators were forced to fly straight and level through a wall of concentrated naval gunfire. Lieutenant Commander John C. Waldron led the 15 planes of Torpedo Squadron 8 directly into the teeth of the enemy formation without a single fighter escort. Within minutes, the sky became a killing ground. The legendary Mitsubishi Zeros of the Japanese Combat Air Patrol swooped down, systematically shredding the lumbering American bombers before they could even drop their weapons. Across that brutal morning, 41 American torpedo bombers from 3 separate aircraft carriers pressed their attacks. 35 of them were violently shot down. Out of all those aircraft, not a single torpedo struck a Japanese hull. On the bridge of the Akagi, Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo watched the ocean swallow the remnants of the American strike. His carriers were completely untouched, slicing through the calm blue water without a single scratch. Every operational assumption held by the Imperial Japanese Navy seemed gloriously validated. Their aircraft were superior, their pilots were peerless, and the clumsy, uncoordinated American counteroffensive was collapsing before their eyes. To the Japanese command, the battle was effectively won. The strike force had absorbed the best the United States Navy had to offer and swept it aside with effortless ease. The brilliant intelligence advantage gained in the Hawaiian basement appeared to have culminated in nothing more than an organized massacre. Joseph Rochefort's fake water message had accurately guided American aviators to the exact coordinates of the enemy armada, only to deliver them straight into an inescapable meat grinder. What was the point of knowing the enemy's most guarded secret if they possessed the terrifying power to annihilate every single squadron you sent against them? But the devastating reality of those failed torpedo attacks was hidden in the invisible mechanics of the battlefield. The American aviators had not scored a single physical hit, but they had violently disrupted the meticulous rhythm of the Japanese operation. To evade the incoming torpedoes, the massive aircraft carriers were forced to engage in frantic, high-speed evasive maneuvers, carving sharp, looping wakes across the Pacific. A carrier desperately weaving to dodge torpedoes cannot launch a coordinated counterstrike. More importantly, the sheer relentless volume of the low-level American attacks had dragged the vaunted Japanese combat air patrol down from the sky. To slaughter the slow-moving devastators, the Zeros had dived almost to the wave tops, burning precious fuel and ammunition. Down in the hangar decks of the Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, sheer chaos reigned. Driven by conflicting intelligence reports and the sudden necessity to defend the fleet, Japanese commanders issued frantic, contradictory orders to rearm their reserve strike aircraft. Torpedoes were swapped for land bombs, and then, as the American fleet was finally spotted, land bombs were frantically swapped back for torpedoes. The enclosed, humid hangar spaces became violently congested. High-octane aviation fuel lines snaked across the steel decks. Heavy, highly explosive ordnance was hastily stacked along the bulkheads rather than being properly secured in armored magazines. The Japanese carriers were no longer just warships. They had inadvertently transformed themselves into massive, floating bombs, waiting for a single spark. Yet, high above this vulnerable powder keg, the American strike force was failing. Lieutenant Commander C. Wade McCluskey, leading the primary dive bomber groups from the Enterprise, was flying through empty sky. He had arrived at the exact coordinates where the Japanese fleet was supposed to be and found nothing but miles of open ocean. The evasive maneuvers triggered by the earlier torpedo attacks had pulled the enemy armada miles away from its projected course. McCluskey's planes were running dangerously low on fuel. His fighter escorts had already turned back or ditched into the sea. Standard naval doctrine dictated an immediate return to the carrier. The immense intelligence advantage, the repaired Yorktown, the desperate torpedo runs, all of it was about to evaporate into the vast expanse of the Pacific. Then, McCluskey looked down and saw a tiny, almost imperceptible physical clue carved into the vast blue surface of the ocean. It was a single, long, white wake. It belonged to the Japanese destroyer Arashi. The lone ship was rushing at maximum speed to rejoin the main carrier force after staying behind to depth charge an American submarine. Weeks earlier, deep in a Hawaiian basement, Joseph Rochefort had stared at two letters, A.F., and deduced the hidden target of the entire Imperial Navy. Now, thousands of feet in the air, McCluskey stared at a single line of white water and deduced the hidden location of the enemy fleet. He didn't turn back. He turned his squadrons to follow the destroyer's wake. At exactly 10:22 a.m., the clouds parted. Below them lay the First Air Fleet. The four Japanese carriers were executing their evasive maneuvers, their flight decks completely exposed. Above them, the sky was utterly empty. The Zeros were still down near the water, recovering from the torpedo attacks. The Japanese high altitude was undefended. Returned to the flight deck of the Akagi, where the morning had begun with supreme confidence. The crew heard the sudden, terrifying scream of the dauntless dive bombers plunging from the sky in a near-vertical descent. There was no time to react. The bombs fell. The flight deck shattered. The uncontained ordnance detonated, and the pride of the Imperial Japanese Navy was obliterated in an instant. History often remembers this exact moment, the sudden destruction of the Japanese carriers at Midway, as a miraculous stroke of incredible luck, a random 5-minute window where the hand of fate simply intervened. It was not. But it was also not a perfectly preordained victory where code-breaking mathematically guaranteed success. The cryptanalysts down in Station HYPO did not sink the Japanese fleet. What they did was actively manufacture a razor-thin informational advantage. They engineered the exact conditions required to position the American carriers in the only patch of ocean where victory was even a theoretical possibility. Within that highly prepared opportunity, everything still hung in the balance. The intelligence victory in Pearl Harbor did not replace the need for courage. It merely built the stage where catastrophic human sacrifice, individual initiative, and battlefield chance actually had the power to change the course of the war. If you trace the fire consuming the flight deck of the Akagi back to its origin, you do not just find a falling bomb, you find a meticulously connected chain of cause and effect. The bomb fell entirely unobstructed because Lieutenant Commander McCluskey noticed the wake of a single destroyer. That destroyer was isolated because the doomed American torpedo squadrons had violently pulled the Japanese defenses down to the wave tops. Those squadrons were only in the air because Admiral Nimitz had ruthlessly bet the survival of his fleet on the coordinates of Point Luck. Nimitz placed that apocalyptic bet because HYPO had definitively confirmed target AF. And AF was only confirmed because a Japanese listening post had intercepted a fake, completely fabricated radio broadcast about a broken desalination plant. The physical destruction of the most powerful carrier strike force on Earth was triggered by a mundane, administrative lie. The Imperial Japanese Navy had expended unimaginable resources on operational secrecy, impenetrable cipher books, and sprawling, multi-layered deception plans. Yet, in the end, they lost their greatest strategic secret not because their code was entirely broken, but because the Americans invented a profoundly boring question, and Japanese intelligence proudly, efficiently, and voluntarily answered it themselves. When the crew of the Akagi confidently stepped onto their pristine flight deck to greet the dawn on the 4th of June, they had absolutely no idea that they were already ghosts. Their decisive mistake had not been made in the skies above the Pacific, but weeks earlier, thousands of miles away. The inescapable trap closing around them was fully armed in the exact moment a dutiful Japanese signals officer routinely intercepted a profoundly boring American complaint about a broken water pipe. Sitting in a quiet listening post, he efficiently followed protocol, encoded the administrative trivia, and voluntarily forwarded the message that AF was short of fresh water. With that single, routine transmission, the greatest fleet on Earth quietly engineered its own destruction.